"You're useless." The word didn't just land, it cut through the room. Laughter followed. Not loud, not explosive, just enough to confirm something uncomfortable and permanent. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever been in a moment where you know, instantly, that something just changed? Not later, not gradually, right there, in real time. That was this moment. The rooftop was glowing. Soft amber lights, polished glass tables, the city stretching endlessly behind them like a promise. Expensive wine, tailored suits, carefully curated laughter, and right in the center of it, Grace Parker, 29. Still. Silent. Her husband, Daniel Parker, stood beside her, smiling like he had just delivered the perfect line. Like this was part of the show. "You're useless." Again, softer this time, like he was doubling down for effect. A few people chuckled. One woman covered her mouth. Someone looked down at their drink. No one challenged it. Why would they? Daniel was the kind of man people didn't question. Confident, connected, the one who hosted, who closed deals, who owned the room. And Grace? She was... what, exactly? Quiet, observant, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But here's the thing. Grace didn't react. No defensive laugh, no sharp comeback, not even a flicker of embarrassment. Nothing. She just stood there. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not wide, not forced, controlled, measured. The kind of smile that doesn't ask for approval, the kind that makes you wonder, wait, does she know something we don't? Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. Not nervous, grounded, anchored, because while everyone else in that moment was reacting, Grace had already decided how this night would go. Let me ask you something. If someone humiliated you like that, in front of colleagues, friends, strangers, what would you do? Snap back? Walk away? Cry later in private? Grace did none of those. She lifted her glass, deliberately. The movement itself pulled attention. Subtle but undeniable. Conversations thinned. Eyes shifted. Even Daniel paused, just slightly, like he expected a joke. Or maybe an apology. That was his first mistake. Grace turned her head just enough to look at him. Not fully, not dramatically, just enough. And then, she said one word. We're not revealing it yet. But here's what matters. The room changed. Instantly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from confusion, but from realization. A man near the edge of the group stopped mid-sip. Someone's glass touched the table a little too hard. A conversation across the room died without explanation. And Daniel? That confidence, that smooth, untouchable presence, it cracked. Just for a second. His smile faltered. His eyes narrowed, searching her face like he had misheard something, like that one word didn't belong in this moment. He leaned in slightly, voice low now, no audience tone, no performance. Wait. A beat. Then quieter. You did what? And that's when you realize this wasn't a reaction. This wasn't emotion. This wasn't even about the insult. This moment? It had been set long before anyone picked up a glass tonight, and whatever Grace just said, it wasn't the beginning of something, it was the end. What kind of wife smiles after being humiliated? That's the question hanging over the night. But to understand Grace Parker's smile, you have to go backward, because moments like that don't come out of nowhere. They're built, quietly, slowly, one small fracture at a time. When Grace met Daniel Parker, he was the kind of man people described with one word: impressive. He wasn't the loudest person in a room, but somehow he always became the center of it. He knew how to talk to anyone: bartenders, executives, investors, strangers. He remembered names. He made eye contact. He made people feel chosen. And in the beginning, he made Grace feel chosen too. She was 26 when they met at a fundraising event through a mutual friend. She was sharp, reserved, and working long hours in financial compliance, a job that rewarded precision, patience, and noticing what other people missed. Daniel liked that about her, or at least he said he did. He called her different, said she was the first person in years who didn't seem impressed by him. That should have meant something. At first, it looked good from the outside, more than good. They were the couple people pointed to. Daniel, polished and ambitious. Grace, elegant and composed. He brought energy. She brought steadiness. He could talk for an hour. She could end a conversation with one sentence that actually mattered. But little things started early. Not enough to call abuse. Not enough to explain to friends without sounding dramatic. Just little things. He interrupted her stories and then told them better. He corrected details that didn't need correcting. He called her adorably intense when she spoke seriously. If she had an opinion at dinner, he'd smile and say, "Grace works with numbers, so naturally she thinks everything has a policy manual." People laughed, and she laughed too. At first, because what do you do when the person humiliating you does it with a smile? You question yourself, that's what. You wonder if you're being too sensitive. You tell yourself it's banter. You tell yourself everybody has a dynamic. You tell yourself marriage is adjustment. But patterns don't stay small forever. As the years passed, Daniel's jokes sharpened. In private, the warmth thinned out. If she challenged him, he'd roll his eyes. If she pointed out something inaccurate, he'd accuse her of trying to win. If she withdrew, he'd say she was cold. And the strangest part? In public, he spoke about their marriage like it was perfect. He toasted to "my brilliant wife." He posted anniversary captions about partnership and trust. He introduced her to clients as "the one who keeps me grounded." Then in the car home, he'd say she embarrassed him by being too quiet. That contradiction stayed with Grace. Public admiration, private contempt, performance in one room, precision in another. So she adapted, not by becoming smaller, but by becoming more observant. That was Daniel's second mistake, because Grace's silence was never emptiness. It was data collection. She noticed how often he dodged direct questions about work, how frequently he talked about expansion but got vague around specifics, how certain expenses didn't align with what he claimed, how he became strangely defensive whenever she asked innocent, practical questions, the kind of questions any financially literate spouse might ask. Then one evening, a piece of mail arrived addressed to both of them. Nothing dramatic, no red stamp, no obvious scandal, just a financial statement from an institution Grace didn't recognize. At first, she assumed it was an error, wrong address, administrative mix-up. Then she opened it. Her eyes scanned the header, the account details, the listed parties, and then she froze. Because attached to an account she had never seen before, an account connected to Daniel, was her name. Not mentioned casually, not mistakenly, formally, legally. As if she had agreed to something she had never even heard of. And in that instant, the marriage she thought she understood shifted into something colder. Because disrespect was one thing, this was something else. This was risk. What happens when the quiet one stops ignoring the details? Grace didn't confront Daniel. That's the first thing you need to understand. She didn't storm into the living room with papers in hand, didn't demand answers, didn't even hint that something was wrong. Instead, she went quiet in a different way. Focused. Because that document, the one with her name on an account she never opened, wasn't just suspicious. It was precise. And Grace's entire career was built on one principle. If something looks clean on the surface but feels off underneath, it usually is. So she started small. She logged into their shared financial accounts, not to accuse, just to observe. Transaction histories, dates, transfers, patterns. At first glance, everything looked normal, clean, organized, but normal can be manufactured. And that's where most people stop looking. Grace didn't. She started cross-referencing, dates of known expenses against transfers, declared income against lifestyle patterns, business announcements against actual cash flow movement, and that's when the inconsistencies began to appear. Not obvious, not sloppy, but subtle enough that only someone trained to look would catch them. Money moving in circles, amounts split just below reporting thresholds, entities with names that sounded legitimate, but didn't quite exist when you looked closely. It wasn't chaos, it was structure, careful, intentional, so designed not to raise alarms unless someone like Grace was paying attention. And then she dug deeper. Quietly. No shared devices, no obvious searches. She used her work habits, separate systems, private logs, encrypted notes, because now the question wasn't, what is this? It was, how far does this go? Days turned into weeks, and the picture became clearer. Daniel wasn't just bending rules, he was building something off books. Shell accounts, layered transactions, funds being routed through joint assets, including ones tied to Grace. That was the part that changed everything. Because this wasn't just his risk, it was hers now, legally, financially, professionally. If anyone looked into it, her name was already there. Let that sink in. Without her consent, she had been placed inside something that could collapse her entire life, her career, her reputation, potentially even her freedom. So what do you do in that situation? Do you confront him and hope he tells the truth? Or do you assume the worst and prepare accordingly? Grace chose the second. That was Daniel's third mistake, because he thought her silence meant ignorance. Instead, it gave her time. She reached out, carefully, to someone she trusted from her compliance network. Not with accusations, just hypotheticals, questions framed in neutral language. What happens if someone's identity is used in filings without full awareness? What protections exist for early disclosure? What differentiates involvement from exposure? The answers were clear. Timing mattered. Documentation mattered. And most importantly, who speaks first matters. That's when Grace made her decision. Not emotional, not impulsive, strategic. She began compiling everything: statements, timelines, connections, every transaction mapped, every inconsistency logged. She separated her financial footprint where she legally could, quietly creating distance without triggering suspicion. And all the while, Daniel carried on exactly the same, confident, untouchable, louder even, especially when his latest deal started gaining attention, the same deal he was celebrating tonight. Which brings us back to the rooftop, but here's the part no one at that party knew. Grace didn't just prepare documents, she sent them, weeks ago, to the right people, through the right channels, with one clear implication: look here. And on the night of Daniel's biggest celebration, hours before she stepped into that rooftop in a black silk dress and a calm expression, Grace sent one final message, short, direct, no emotion. "Everything is in place." The reply came almost instantly. "We'll proceed." Now ask yourself, proceed with what? The insult wasn't the breaking point, it was the signal. Let's go back to the rooftop. Same lights, same skyline, same carefully curated crowd. But now, you see it differently. Because this was never just a party. It was a stage. Daniel stood near the center, glass in hand, retelling the story of his latest deal like it was already legend. People leaned in, nods, laughter at the right moments, the rhythm of admiration he had perfected over years. And Grace? She stood beside him, not behind, not hidden, present, watching, tracking. Because while everyone else saw a celebration, Grace saw timing. You ever notice how some people get louder when they feel untouchable? That was Daniel tonight. His jokes sharper, his tone looser, his confidence borderline careless. And then it happened. A woman across the group, Lena, one of Daniel's colleagues, asked Grace a simple question. "So, what do you think about the expansion? It must be exciting, right?" A normal question. An easy one. Grace opened her mouth to answer, but Daniel cut in. Of course he did. "Oh, Grace doesn't really get into this side of things," he said, smiling like it was harmless. "She prefers rules and spreadsheets." A few polite laughs. Grace didn't react, but Daniel wasn't done. He looked at her now, tilting his head slightly like he was setting up the punchline. "You're useless." There it was. Not disguised, not softened, placed directly in front of everyone. And this time, he held the silence after it, like he wanted it to land. And it did, but not the way he expected. Because here's what Daniel didn't know. Everything had already been set in motion before he ever picked up that glass. Grace felt the shift before she even moved. Not emotional, environmental, a subtle tightening in the room, a pause that didn't belong to social discomfort, but to something else. Near the bar, a man checked his watch, then his phone. At the far edge of the rooftop, someone stepped slightly away from the group, speaking quietly into a sleeve. Another guest, someone Daniel had introduced earlier but no one really knew, was watching Grace now. Not casually, intentionally. And still, Grace didn't react to the insult, because the insult didn't matter anymore. It was just timing. So she smiled, small, controlled, precise, and she lifted her glass. That movement, that simple, elegant motion, cut through the noise more effectively than any argument could have. People noticed, because confidence without explanation is unsettling. And Grace, in that moment, looked completely unshaken, which didn't make sense. Not to them, not to Daniel. He expected embarrassment, maybe tension, maybe a quiet argument later, but not this, never this. She turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough. And then she spoke. One word, clear, calm, final. Audit. It didn't sound loud, but it carried. And for a second, nothing happened. No one reacted. Like the word itself needed a moment to be understood. Then, you could see it. Recognition. Not from everyone, but from the right people. The man near the bar stopped moving entirely. The unknown guest straightened slightly. Someone near the entrance shifted position, subtle but deliberate. And Daniel? That's where everything broke, because his face, it didn't just change, it drained. Color gone, smile gone, certainty gone. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for something, a joke, a bluff, a misunderstanding, anything. Wait, he said, voice lower now, closer, tighter. You did what? And in that moment, for the first time that night, Daniel wasn't the one in control of the room anymore. Audit. One word. Not loud, not aggressive, not emotional. But it didn't need to be. Because unlike everything Daniel had said that night, everything performative, exaggerated, designed for reaction, Grace's word was real. And reality has weight. At first, the room didn't fully understand it. You could see that hesitation ripple across faces. People trying to decide if they missed something, if this was some kind of inside joke, if they were supposed to laugh. No one did. Because the people who did understand, they weren't laughing. The man near the bar, the one who had checked his phone earlier, set his glass down slowly, too carefully, like he didn't want to draw attention but couldn't afford to move casually anymore. The unfamiliar guest took a step forward, calm, measured, and then everything started aligning. Grace didn't move. She didn't explain herself. She didn't repeat the word. She didn't need to. Because this moment, the one Daniel thought he controlled, had already been decided weeks ago. Let's make this clear. Grace reported everything. Not impulsively, not emotionally, precisely. Every discrepancy she found, documented. Every transaction, mapped. Every account, cross-referenced. She didn't accuse blindly. She built a case. And when she was certain, when there was no room for doubt, she handed it over through formal channels. Compliance authorities, financial investigators, the kind of people who don't react quickly, but act decisively. And here's the part Daniel never saw coming. Grace didn't just report him, she protected herself by going first, by documenting her lack of consent, by proving timeline separation, by showing exactly when she became aware and exactly what she did after. That distinction? It's everything. Because in cases like this, there are only two positions, complicit or cooperating. Grace made sure there was no confusion about which one she was. Now back to the rooftop. Daniel's breathing had changed, subtle, but visible if you were watching closely. Faster, shallower. His mind was catching up. "Grace," he started, but there was no structure to it, no confidence, just fragments. She met his eyes for the first time fully that night. Not angry, not emotional, certain. That's what unsettled him most, because anger he could handle. Certainty? That meant this wasn't a reaction. It was a conclusion. Two people approached now, the man from the bar and the unknown guest. No sudden movements, no raised voices, just presence. "Daniel Parker?" one of them said calmly. That was it. No drama. But the entire room shifted again, because now it was undeniable. This wasn't social anymore. This was real. Daniel looked around instinctively, like the room that once supported him might still hold. It didn't. No one stepped in. No one laughed. No one defended him, because the moment Grace said audit, the story changed, and everyone felt it. He tried once more, quieter now, almost a whisper. "You set me up." Grace tilted her head slightly. "No," she said evenly. "You did." And that was the truth of it. Not poetic, not exaggerated, just accurate, because everything that was happening to Daniel in that moment was already in motion long before tonight. The investigators didn't rush him. They didn't need to. They asked him to step aside, to talk privately. And for the first time in years, Daniel complied without controlling the situation, without leading, without speaking over anyone. He walked. Not confidently, not defiantly, just walked. The party didn't end immediately, but it fractured. Clusters of whispers, avoided eye contact, quiet exits, phones buzzed, messages sent, but no one approached Grace right away. Because what do you say to someone who just dismantled a life without raising her voice? Eventually, Lena, the same woman who asked Grace that question earlier, stepped closer. Her voice was softer now. "Did you know?" she asked. Grace took a small breath. "Yes." No elaboration, because there was nothing else to explain. The story didn't explode overnight. It unfolded, controlled, documented, verified. Daniel's business came under formal investigation. Fraud, financial misrepresentation, misuse of identity. Accounts were frozen, partnerships paused, associates questioned. The same people who once praised him, they distanced themselves quickly, not dramatically, quietly, because reputation once cracked doesn't shatter loudly, it erodes. Grace, on the other hand, was never charged, never implicated. Her early disclosure protected her completely. Legally, she was clear. Professionally, something unexpected happened. Respect. Not loud, not performative, but real. Because people in her field understood exactly what she had done. How difficult it is to recognize risk that close to home. How rare it is to act on it without hesitation. How precise the timing had to be. She didn't just avoid damage, she demonstrated control. The marriage didn't end in a fight. There was no final argument, no dramatic goodbye, just paperwork. Separation filed within weeks, assets reviewed, divided under legal supervision, no reconciliation attempts, no emotional appeals, because whatever existed between them ended the moment truth replaced performance. So how did Grace feel? That's the question, right? Relief? Yes. But not the kind people expect. Not explosive, not overwhelming, quiet, like tension leaving a room you didn't realize you were holding together. There was no victory in it, no celebration, just alignment. Everything finally matching what it actually was. No more contradictions, no more pretending not to see. Weeks later, a different setting, no skyline, no audience, a quiet balcony, morning light, a single glass, not wine this time, just water. Grace stood alone, no performance, no observation, just stillness. She placed the glass down gently on the table. Same motion as that night. But this time, no one was watching. And that was the difference. Because the moment on the rooftop, that wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about choosing when the truth would arrive and making sure. When it did, it stayed. Grace looked out over the city, not searching, not reflecting dramatically, just present. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing hidden underneath the surface. No contradiction, no calculation left to make, just clarity and control. She exhaled slowly, then almost to herself. Timing is everything. And this time, there was no one left to misunderstand it.